Let's jump right in. Today, we're digging into a fascinating and honestly kind of tragic piece of operational history. We're going to break down how a massive, seemingly invincible mountain fortress in the Himalayas didn't fall to overwhelming firepower, but rather to a total collapse in command. We're exploring the 1962 Sino-Indian War, specifically the absolute disaster at Se La and Bomdi. So, let's get into it.
It really brings up a fundamental question we always ask in military history. Can strong terrain actually fail you? We're so used to thinking of the high ground as an absolute guarantee of defensive success, right? Well, to answer that, we've got to analyze this catastrophic 1962 debacle in the Kameng sector. Because if this case study proves anything, it's that mountains alone do not stop armies. Here's a quick roadmap for our explainer today. We'll look at the seemingly unbeatable terrain, map out the original fortress defense plan, and then trace the incredible Chinese maneuver that bypassed it all. After that, we'll examine the crisis of decision that led to the collapse, witness a heroic final stand at Lajialagampa, and wrap up with the major lessons learned from this defeat.
All right, let's kick things off with the terrain. Because honestly, on paper, this battlefield geography heavily favored the Indian defenders. It literally should have been a tactician's dream.
Just picture this single geographical spine running south. If an invading force wanted to push through, they had a really predictable, narrow corridor to navigate. They had to move down from Tawang, climb through the towering heights of the Se La Pass, drop into the Dirang Valley, push up over a secondary ridge at Bomdi, and only then could they hit the plains of Assam.
And sitting squarely like a massive roadblock on that corridor was Se La. The natural advantages here were absolutely insane. We're talking about incredibly steep mountain slopes sitting at nearly 13,700 feet. That gives you phenomenal fields of fire to just rain down on anyone trying to approach. Plus, it had huge drop zones for aircraft resupply and, absolutely crucial for surviving a siege, a steady supply of fresh water from twin lakes right near the top. Basically, it was a position perfectly designed to hold an enemy off until the brutal Himalayan winter rolled in and completely froze the Chinese supply lines.
So, knowing all these advantages, the initial Indian military strategy was actually super robust. Let's look at how they planned to lock this whole route down.
They set up what's essentially a box defense, a real fortress strategy. First, you have the main shield at Se La, which was the vital ground, heavily packed with 5 battalions from the 62nd Brigade. Then, providing a crucial layer of depth about 60 miles back, you had Bomdi, held by the 48th Brigade. And the plan was to heavily stock both of these perimeters with enough rations and ammo to easily outlast a 15 to 20-day siege. When you look really closely at the tactical layout at Se La, you see a seriously defended perimeter. You've got battalions completely dug in along the ridges and the river lines. This force was more than ready to absorb and repel massive frontal assaults. They were stocked up, they held the high ground, and honestly, any student of military history would look at this setup and tell you Se La could have held out indefinitely against the forces the Chinese had available.
But here is where the operational history gets incredibly wild, because the Chinese strategy, it was absolutely not to smash their troops against that heavily fortified Se La shield. No way.
Instead, they pulled off this brilliant and just audacious three-pronged maneuver. First, their 55 Division applied heavy pressure right at the front, which basically locked the Indian defenders in place at Se La. Second, Force 419 somehow slipped through this incredibly tight, seemingly impossible corridor into the west. And then came the true knockout blow. The 11th Division executed this massive wide eastern flanking maneuver to completely isolate the rear.
If you trace those sweeping arrows on this operational sketch, you can see just how incredible this was. It wasn't just a simple flank, it was a superhuman feat of infantry endurance. The Chinese 11th Division marched roughly 160 kilometers in just 6 days and 7 nights, traversing brutal, high-altitude terrain, carrying practically everything on their backs. They completely bypassed the mighty Se La fortress, dropped right in behind the Indian lines, snapped their communications, and just completely cut off the road to Dirang.
Now, as the Chinese are closing this net, the true failure of the battle begins, and it is absolutely vital to understand that this defense did not break in the trenches, it broke in the headquarters. The entire command structure just fractured. You had an army commander sitting hundreds of miles away in Lucknow, trying to plan operations off a map without any real feel for the actual terrain. Then you had a newly appointed corps commander who severely lacked battle experience. So when these Chinese roadblocks suddenly appeared in the rear, instead of issuing firm, decisive orders to hold the fortress, all these crucial defensive decisions were just left hanging in fatal ambiguity. The clear fortress plan rapidly devolved into utter confusion, and then, disastrously, into orders to withdraw.
And that sparked a totally devastating chain reaction. Premature, highly untactical withdrawals were ordered. This meant Chinese troops could literally just walk right into prepared, fortified Indian positions without firing a single shot. Since the units were pulling back piecemeal and completely disorganized, they got isolated on these narrow mountain roads where they were easily ambushed. In a matter of hours, the entire 4th Infantry Division plunged into a complete structural breakdown.
Yet, even amidst this absolute chaos of retreat and total command paralysis, there were these flashes of incredible, albeit tragic, heroism on the ground that we really have to highlight.
As the fragmented elements of the Indian army were desperately trying to fall back through the mountains, a small group from the 40 Rajput Regiment, led by a highly respected officer named Lieutenant Colonel Brahmanand Avasti, was trying to navigate the withdrawal routes. Right near an old monastery called Lagyala Gampa, they walked directly into a massive 500-strong Chinese ambush force that was just waiting for them.
Facing absolutely overwhelming odds, Colonel Avasti and his men made a choice. Rather than scatter or try to flee, they counterattacked. Lacking heavy firepower, they engaged the Chinese in brutal, hand-to-hand combat. They fought relentlessly for hours until they suffered a staggering 100% casualty rate. Every single man, including Avasti, was killed or wounded.
Avasti's final resistance is just a somber, really powerful reminder of the sheer caliber of the men fighting on the ground. As one general later remarked, if he had a few more officers like Lt. Colonel Avasti, the story of 1962 would have been very different. The troops were absolutely willing to fight. They were just completely failed by top-level command paralysis and indecision.
So, how do we process all this? How do we make sense of the complete disintegration of a division that was sitting in what was supposedly an unbeatable position?
Well, historical comparisons help a lot. If we look at the Khamung sector alongside the famous Chosin Reservoir battle during the Korean War in 1950, we see something interesting. The Chinese used the exact same tactics against the U.S. 1st Marine Division, wide flanking, infiltration, cutting off the rear. But the Marines at Chosin survived as a fighting force and actually inflicted massive casualties on the Chinese. Why? Because they maintained a cohesive, resolute command under immense pressure. And that is exactly what was missing at Se La.
So the takeaways from this explainer are pretty stark. First, the strongest mountains in the world cannot compensate for leaders who lack the will to fight. Second, command cohesion is non-negotiable. When generals panic, it's the soldiers who pay the ultimate price. Third, indecision in the face of the enemy breeds absolute panic right down the chain of command. And finally, attempting an untactical withdrawal from a fortress position almost always guarantees a disorganized rout.
Which brings us to our final lingering thought. You can hold the highest peaks, build the deepest bunkers, and field the bravest soldiers imaginable. But terrain only shapes a battle. A defense fails first in decision before it fails on ground. So it really leaves you wondering, how many other seemingly impregnable fortresses throughout history have fallen not to superior firepower, but simply to a lack of willpower at the very top? Thanks for hanging out with me for this briefing. Keep questioning and keep learning.